So for assignment 7, question 1, we were to make the graphics object for textures. So here's the class that I've created. It's pretty simple. Just take the texture and the texture shader. The implementation's pretty straightforward. Just pull the data from the constructor, and then basically just render it like we've done everything else in the past. I am not setting the shader context here. I'm actually setting it in the DrawInDX app, since it's going to be using the same shader. I am controlling the texture pointer about when it gets set to context, but I don't want to actually create or delete the pointer here, because you could have 10,000 objects with the same texture, so that'll save memory. And for the actual creation, just create the texture shader, load the textures, the models, and pass all that information, and then just call the render on it. It's pretty straightforward. You end up with something like this. I may or may not use this model, but that's about it for that one. So for question 2, we were to do the graphics object for the light color shader. Again, pretty straightforward. Here's the new class. Again, takes a shader and just takes the material data, and you pass it in through set color and material. Set some defaults first. What is going on? You set some defaults, and then again, just call render, but this time you send the world and material information to the shader, which again, you've already gets set to context in DrawScene, just like it did for the texture. We also do the spotlight. And again, it's pretty simple to create. Just create the model, the new graphics object, pass all that information, and then you end up with something like this, where you can see the color and the light reflecting off it. So it's pretty neat. Okay. So for question 3, we were to do the same, but for the texture light, just like the color, except now we're adding the texture member, but still having set the world and material and adding a set texture. Again, just about the same as before. We're just adding the texture here, and setting it to context like we do a regular texture, and then just send the color information and the world information. And that's pretty simple for the implementation. Again, for the actual creation, just create the light shader, send some directional light, load up some models, and then just send the color material, and we end up with this. You can see the light coming. At some point, you can kind of see the light coming. I don't have a good angle on it. There we go. Okay. And then again, for the drawing, just like we do, we set the spotlight, and then we're setting it to context since we're only using a single shader. And so, yeah, we end up with that. So for question 4, we were to modify the graphics objects to support multiple meshes. I'll take the texture graphics object first. Basically, I'm creating an array of texture pointers, which we can then set based on an index, which would correspond to the mesh number. So here's the creation of the array of pointers. And then we're just setting a default to whatever texture was passed in. We want to delete the texture array pointer, but not each texture, since it could be reused elsewhere. And then again, this is just setting them all to the same. And this is just setting an individual mesh. The render is pretty close to what it was, except for now we are calling render mesh for each of the supplied textures and for each mesh. And so let's see. Implementation-wise, we are looking at just a second. Okay, so now that since we're using the non-lit texture as an example, it's kind of hard to see, but we are creating two graphics objects, one that's using a single texture and one that passes in a default but overrides the default with on mesh 1 and 2. So it's messed up. Again, we're just calling render on it. I don't know why it's saying that it's undefined, but that's the light. Again, we're just doing basic texture, setting into the context, setting the camera matrix, and then calling render on it. And for the texture, we end up getting this. You can see how we're using the brick for the chimney and the walls. We got the crate for the roof, and then we got kind of the dice texture for the door. And now let's go back through and switch to the texture with the light. Start that running. So again, we're doing similar to what we were doing before, an array of texture pointers. But in this situation, I'm also creating arrays of for the colors for each of the meshes. Not the cleanest way to do it, but it'll work. And then we can still set things either all at once or by a given index. And we end up with this same texture setup as before, but we can sort of see the light. There we go. You can see the light on that one. Again, we're just looping through for each mesh for setting it, and then for rendering for each mesh, we set the texture to context, send the material, and then just call render on it. We already looked at app, and then so that's pretty much it for the for those. And I did each of the others have kind of a similar setup. Okay, so for the further work, for setting mesh-specific shaders, I basically took what I had done from the number 4, and I kind of grouped all the objects into a proper, kind of a separate entity, including the pointer to the shader, and then I just created arrays of that type. And I also, inside the shader base, I created a virtual method for sending pretty much all the information that the shaders are going to need at this point. Not really a fan of that, but it's a possible way to do it. And then going back to the we'll check out shader texture light where we kind of implement that. So the send data, this is in the shader texture light, is an implementation of that method, where basically we just take that and send it, take the parameters and send it to the proper data, which are already methods already defined up here. I do that for the texture light, and I also did it for the color light. For the actual texture light, again, just like before, I'm creating the array to hold all the information. This time it's of that mesh properties object with some defaults. And then I'm going to, obviously in the destructor, I'm going to delete each of the mesh properties and the array. And then here's some setters. And then in the render, basically just looping through for each mesh, pulling off the shader from the properties, setting that to the context, and then sending that data to the shader, just like we've done in the past, through that new method I defined. Also, because we're doing that, I had to pass all of that needed info as parameters to the render. I'll probably revisit that and kind of, I don't know, not really a fan, but it'll work. Inside the DX app, again, loading up the textures. One thing on a side note, one thing is I would probably collapse all the graphics objects into a single one if I'm doing it like this, into a single type. But in this case, I'm just going to use this one. Basically, since I've created the two textures, set a directional light on both the shaders, create the graphics object for the two objects, and then this will set, since it's going to set all of the materials to those colors, I'll overwrite one of the meshes there, and then inside the draw, again, just set the spotlight parameters for each shader, pass that information that's required, and then we just end up with this. You can see how the light, you can see how it's two different, one uses the color light and one's using the texture light. So yeah, that's about it.